back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the Civil War, and in this lesson we're going to talk about one of the most important developments and outcomes of the war, which obviously is the end of slavery. In this lesson we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln is sometimes known as the Great Emancipator, and while that title may be appropriate from the vantage point of national politics, Lincoln and the nation were driven towards emancipation by many factors, not least of which was the process of self-emancipation, as slaves ran away by the tens, hundreds, and eventually thousands as the war went on. From the earliest days of the war, slaves in the South took advantage of this opportunity to leave the plantations and run towards the Union Army camps. The growing numbers of self-emancipated slaves in these camps were one of the major factors that Lincoln had to consider as he pondered the process of emancipation. Now, clearly, Lincoln had always been and was always opposed to slavery itself. He thought it was an abhorrent institution. But he wrestled with the political realities of trying to end slavery and also to bring the Union back together. In the early stages of the war, Lincoln always said the primary purpose of the war was to preserve the Union and bring the Union back together, not to free the slaves. But as the war went on, emancipating the slaves clearly became one of its key objectives. Thoughts of emancipating the slaves began as a wartime measure. As described a moment ago, slaves leaving their plantations and seeking out the Union Army proved to be very disruptive to Southerners and to the Confederate war effort. And so, in some ways, emancipation is viewed as a way of helping the Northern war effort. There were a number of acts early in the war in that direction. In August 1861, the first Confiscation Act declared free any slaves that were used in the Confederate war effort. In July 1862, a second Confiscation Act followed, which empowered the Army to seize and render free the slaves of anyone aiding the Confederacy. As the war lingered, it became clear that the prospect of slaves running away and or being freed by Union forces proved very destabilizing in the South, and so it became actually a key element in the Union war strategy to end slavery or encourage the slaves to run away. On July 22, 1862, Lincoln informed his cabinet that this was the direction he was moving and that he wanted to issue an emancipation decree. The next step became the timing of it. At that point, much of the war effort had not been going well for the Union, as I've described in previous lectures. And so Lincoln and Union forces were waiting for a victory, a sign of momentum, a prospect that the Union was actually going to win this war before they announced emancipation. That victory came in the Battle of Antietam, which was fought in mid-September of 1862, when McClellan finally attacked Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army. This battle was one of the bloodiest ever fought up to that point, and the bloodiest single day of the war, when nearly 6,000 soldiers between the two sides were killed and 18,000 or so were wounded. This was also one of the moments when photography served to shock the nation to the horrors of this war. The battlefield photographs of Alexander Gardner, like the one pictured here, showed Americans just how grim the battlefields of this war were. And while it was something of a Pyrrhic victory, as losses on both sides were severe, McClellan was able to declare victory in the aftermath of this battle because Lee and his army abandoned the fight and chose to retreat and fight another day. And so, in the aftermath of this victory at Antietam, Lincoln was able to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, preliminarily announced in September of 1862 and going into effect on January 1st, 1863. You can read the wording of this proclamation here, but note that it only freed the slaves in the Confederate States. As it says, all persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion against the United States. So it only frees the slaves in Confederate states, and at this stage of the war, when things were very much undecided, it didn't technically accomplish the abolition of slavery, but rather announces the intention of the nation. If and when this war ends, and certainly if and when it ends in a Northern victory, slavery will then be abolished. In the course of the war, though, it did serve to encourage slaves to run away. As word of the announcement spread throughout the South, the process of self-emancipation I described a few minutes ago only continued and accelerated. It also allowed for growing numbers of blacks to serve in the Union Army. Over the course of the war, about 200,000 blacks fought for the Union side, and about 38,000 were killed in the war. Now we should note, it's sometimes said that the Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery, and that is a misstatement, although the intentions were to set the table for the end of slavery. It didn't actually accomplish that. It's not until the 13th Amendment, passed on December 18th, 1865, after the Civil War is over, by the Northern Congress, that slavery was fully abolished. As that amendment read, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment of crime, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So let's think a little bit more about why Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation and what this was all about. Well, first of all, again, bear in mind that at this point the war is still very much in doubt. This is really a wartime measure, first and foremost, to advance the cause of the Union fight. Slavery itself was still very much an issue under debate. There were many in the North who were still okay with slavery, and we will talk about issues of equality and rights once the slaves are freed a little bit later in the course. But we are still a long way from most people, even in the North, believing that the slaves should be equal to whites. So this isn't necessarily about achieving equality for blacks. This was a wartime measure. But this did force the issue, and particularly forced the issue in terms of what to do with the fugitive slaves, the growing numbers of self-emancipated slaves. And this, again, will allow them to take a greater role in fighting with the Union Army if they chose to do that. So why did Lincoln move at this time towards emancipation? Well, again, slaves were a boost to the Confederate cause, and so the more slaves they could be convinced to try to run away, the more that might undermine the Confederate cause. This also is a morale booster for the North, and again, coupled with quote-unquote victory in the Battle of Antietam, it suggests a shifting in the momentum of the war. The underlying message to the Emancipation Proclamation is one that would have made people feel very positive in the North. When we win this war, slavery will be ended. And so it's pointing towards a positive outcome for the North. This is also in keeping with public opinion, which, as I've mentioned, was very much divided, but is shifting and growing increasingly in the direction of moving towards emancipation. There's also the continuing prospect that France and Britain might support the South. I talked in a previous lecture about the importance of cotton to those nations. But If we abolish slavery, France and Britain are more likely to support the Union as opposed to the Confederacy. They were not likely to support a Confederacy that was rooted in slavery. And finally, we have to acknowledge that this simply was the morally right thing to do. And certainly Abraham Lincoln, throughout his career and in his many speeches and the Lincoln-Douglas debates and so on, Lincoln was morally opposed to slavery. And while he was very politically aware, he knew that it was the right thing to do to try to end slavery.